Hello and welcome to Newsroom's latest episode of Raw Politics. This is a weekly visual and audio political chat with myself, Jo Moyer, and I'm here in sunny Auckland with Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Good morning.
And down in Wellington, on his lonesome, we have Sam Suchdeva. Hi, Sam.
Hello, Jo. Thanks for betraying me.
This week we are analysing Chris Hipkins and Chris Luxon as they start to reveal themselves, and we're chatting AI. To wrap things up, we'll each offer a recommendation for something we've enjoyed this week that we think you might too. So let's get started with the leaders. Now, this week we have seen Christopher Luxon, the National Party leader, kick off his Getting New Zealand Back on Track tour. He had a meeting on Wednesday up here in Auckland in Northcote, where he had an afternoon audience, so I guess a particular type of audience, a little bit older, a little bit greyer. And of course this weekend we are heading into the Labour Party Congress, which is the election year sort of annual get-together of the Labour Party, and of course the first time that Chris Hipkins will speak to party faithful as leader. So we're going to start to get a little bit of a sense of, who these guys are, what they're about, and they're going to have to start talking a little bit more about what drives them and what makes them tick. I want to start, Tim, with you in terms of Chris Luxon. This meeting that he had in Auckland, the idea was that they were meant to be talking about things like the economy, the cost of living, the budget, etc. He was hoping that questions would kind of be framed around that. That's not what happened. Talk us through how that meeting kind of ended up playing out.
Well, it's one of these things. You launch a roadshow called Getting New Zealand Back on Track, but the people don't want to get on track. They want to get onto their issues, and you're taking it to the people. It's that phase of the campaign now where you're exposing yourself more directly to audiences and to voters. Interesting. Yes, he would keep saying about economy that works for you, public service that works, tax system, individual responsibility, all these sorts of things. But people keep coming back to things as, specific as the naming in Māori of government agencies, the Māori seats, co-governance, votes on local government authorities, all these sorts of things. I went to another public meeting with national MPs this week and the same thing happened. The biggest theme was on things Māori, bicultural issues, co-governance, and it came up there as well, government department names. So these are raw things that when you take yourself out to the people let you have it, and you've got to be ready for it, and you've got to have answers, and you've got to know where you're going to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the responses, it kind of showed that Chris Luxon's got a particular line he wants to use, but then if you continue to be sort of pressured and prompted by the audience and things that they want to talk about, it's kind of inevitable that you start to derail a little bit unless you can find, I guess, a down the middle, a sort of a centrist type approach to these things. And I think with some of his answers at that meeting in Northcote, he started off by talking about the fact that he himself was on a te reo, journey and was wanting to learn the language, but that's not for everyone. And that, basically people can decide whether they want to use waka kotahi or whether they want to talk about the transport agency. But then as the questions kept coming, he found himself in a situation where he ended up saying that, it's incredibly difficult to navigate our government at the moment. And I think that in a country where everyone speaks English and people can't distinguish between the likes of Te Whātau Ora, which is the Health New Zealand agency, or Waka Kotahi, which is the transport agency, that's really difficult. I mean, you start to unpick that, and for a start, well, not everyone in New Zealand speaks English, so that's not actually accurate. But secondly, he has in that answer explained that actually both exist. There is the English name and there is the Māori name, and you can choose which one you want to use. And if you Google either, you get the same result. So getting into this language of, it's incredibly difficult, I think is just heading down a particular line. And it led to questions like, have you been talking to New Zealand First? I mean, what's your take on this, Sam? Is it sort of a dangerous road to go down?
Yeah, I mean, I think you had it right at the start, Jo, when you pointed out that this is a very specific demographic and it's not representative even of National's wider voting population. So I think you've got to remember when you go into events like this that you're still talking to the wider country, to New Zealand as a whole, and not to, the very self-selecting, quite right-leaning people who are going to be in the room. So I think that's a risk for him, right? And you've seen David Seymour handle this relatively well in a slightly different context when he went on a fringe radio network and was pressed on things around transgender rights, and rather than going along to get along and agreeing with the Prem has sort of pushed back and asked for an explanation. I don't think that's what Luxon has managed to do so far.
Yeah, well, public meetings are a really important part of the political mix because I think they make politicians reveal more of themselves. They're not the set piece speeches, they're not the press releases. Handlers aren't there often directly, and they're facing people. And yes, Sam, you're right, self-selecting audiences who rock up at night or at lunchtime to a public meeting with a politician. But they put things on politicians they've got to be ready for. And there are points of least resistance that I think a lot of them go for. They end up kind of starting not to engage with it, but then sort of agreeing and revealing a bit more of perhaps deep down what they think. And that happened with Luxon. It happened also in the meeting I went to with Paul Goldsmith as well. The public meeting puts people on the spot for good or bad.
Well, and I mean, on that further, it speaks to whether you're agile as a political leader as well, right? And I guess that is something that Christopher Luxon could potentially get better at as he goes along. And maybe it would be a little bit too critical to say that at this point, when he's only just starting to get out and talking in the regions and cities and sort of getting a feel for how it all works, that could improve. I guess if you compare him with someone like Chris Hipkins, who's been around a lot longer, he gets that sort of career politician game and is probably, I guess, definitely a lot more agile in the House. Again, whether that actually transfers to public meetings is yet to be seen. But yeah, that's going to be interesting when it comes to things like leaders' debates further down the line, and having that ability to be agile and flexible and sort of respond to things in the moment will be interesting to watch. Just, on Labour, Sam, obviously we've got the Congress this weekend, so it's kind of a weird one in that, the last time the party got together, Jacinda Ardern was there. She's now not. She's also not going to come along because of that whole risk of being a distraction, which Chris Hipkins doesn't want. He's also not going to have his kids there because he doesn't like his kids to be part of politics. And so it's very much going to be him. He doesn't have that sort of, hugging the family, soft, fluffy stuff to fall back on, but also probably needs to take the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into like what makes him tick, where he comes from, and who he is as a person beyond sausage rolls and loving a Coke Zero. How do you think that's going to go for him at the weekend, Sam?
Yeah, a great question. I don't know that I've got a great answer to that. It is going to be a little bit of a challenge, and I think he runs the risk a little bit of falling into becoming a bit of a cliche, with all this talk of bread and butter and yes, the endless sausage rolls when you've got the King of England or the King of New Zealand, in fact, giving you sausage rolls, and the American Secretary of State being briefed to provide a Coke Zero to you. You get a little bit of that cringe factor. Having said that, I think it probably does play relatively well with the New Zealand audience. I don't know that people are going to be that worked up about it if you look at the wider electorate. But there does need to be a little bit. He's got the same problem to maybe a slightly lesser degree than Christopher Luxon in terms of what is, Chris Hipkins' positive vision for New Zealand. And we know what he doesn't want to do in terms of the policies that have been scrapped, and we know that he wants to take a relatively austere approach, so to speak. But what is, when we get out of a crisis situation and it's business as usual, or as close to business as usual as we get in this fraught period, what is his government going to achieve? So there are some gaps to be filled in there.
I'm looking forward to seeing him in the raw, exposed to these audiences, some that won't be favourable, in a retail political setting. I've not seen him in that. I haven't been when he was obviously in his own electorate in the past. He will have done lots of them and been exposed at rallies and meetings and even conferences, but as leader, it's a different thing. I ran into someone who had been an opponent of his politically in the past, just to get an idea of what they thought his capacity and what he might bring to this campaign. And the answer really surprised me. This person said he's a political savant and he is someone that National just cannot underestimate. That was interesting to me, and it wasn't done for effect. It was just a natural response. So who knows what he can bring.
Yeah, and one thing that was interesting about the interview I did with Chris Hipkins a couple of months into the job earlier this year was that he talked about the fact that he really wanted to be speaking to audiences and people who don't necessarily naturally like him or the Labour Party. And so he was speaking specifically about the fact that he wanted to spend a lot more time in Auckland with business circles. He clearly has a good relationship with Simon Bridges in terms of the Chamber of Commerce. But it's interesting that he is focusing on going to talk to and see people and hang out with people that, you know, are not easy voters or easy wins for Labour, which I think is probably fair to say Jacinda Ardern had moved away from that towards the end of her time as Prime Minister and leader. It was more about sort of hanging out with and being around comfortable, warm, welcoming audiences. So, you know, if Chris Hipkins can do that and can play that well and make it a strength, then I think, you know, that's a smart move.
And Sam, if there was a debate held this week between these two leaders, my view would be that Hipkins would run all over Luxon, that he is far more agile, far more kind of plugged in and attuned to numbers, although he's had some slip-ups with that, I know, in the House. But I just think at the moment, he'd be all over him. How does Luxon train up for that?
Oh, I agree entirely. And look, I'm sure you've got Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis, two former Vic debaters, I think, very well versed in this area. So I'm sure they're going to be running him through some pretty hardcore drills between now and what sort of September will be when we'll likely have the first debate. So, I mean, it's kind of hard if you don't have that innate agility and that ability to think on your feet. It's really hard to develop that suddenly. So it's going to be probably having some stock lines and variations on them that you can sort of throw out and try and look like you're being really agile without sounding too rehearsed. So it's going to be tough for him, I think.
What, like Talofa, my husband's from Samoa?
Can I just pick up on one line just while we're talking about Chris Luxon and sort of being under pressure and things just kind of coming out of his mouth and maybe need to be a little bit more careful about that. I thought that Matthew Scott's story on Newsroom this week about that meeting in Northcote was fascinating when one person in the audience asked about ACC reform. And Christopher Luxon's response was, oh, well, no, we don't want to do anything in that space because we don't want to end up like a litigious, United States. And then went on to use the example of when he was living in Chicago. And if his kids wanted to have friends to come over and play on the trampoline, he'd get the parents to sign a liability waiver just because of the way that the US is when it comes to that sort of thing. And I just thought, what a weird thing to tell people.
Well, it's not really in touch, is it? If he's rated as being out of touch, and that's just one of those things that no one who hasn't lived in the States can relate to that.
Yeah, well, we've talked to our resident American expert, Mark Dalder, and he said that this is not a normal thing that happens in the United States. I'm, obviously aware of the sort of litigious culture, and I know the number of sort of waivers you have to sign when you do group tours and things like that, but I don't think that most parents are getting little Timmy to sign a waiver for any maiming that happens while he's having a play date after school.
Yeah, I mean, it says something about the parents of the kids, and it also says something about Christopher Luxon. It's just all very odd.
One of the things with leaders like this, when, Luxon is in a pretty poor place, personal polling wise. And one of the things that happens at this stage of the cycle is that the MPs out in the field start to get asked questions, awkward questions about their boss. And it happened to the public meeting I went to in St Heliers right at the end. A bloke just, after all the talk of race and Māori issues and co-governance and so on, the last question, a bloke just looked at Paul Goldsmith and Simon O'Connor and said, does your guy have the spine to carry through on these things? And of course then Goldsmith, who is answering, sputters and wavers and kind of offers a few things about Luxon having got the National Party caucus into line, and that was very important. And he's been good on co-governance and he's been strong on tax, but you could see his mind ticking over thinking, oh gosh, I don't want these questions. And they're all going to get them, and it lasts as long as there's pressure poll-wise on the main guy.
So how does that play out though if you reverse it and you think, okay, Chris Hipkins is going to go out and be having to chat in these sorts of environments as well? What I mean, are some of these people that are going to the Christopher Luxon meetings also going to turn up at the Chris Hipkins meetings and say, why are you putting these names on government departments? Or what are the difficult issues that Chris Hipkins is going to have to face?
Well, there'll be those ones, and those people probably will. That's what I think, is that they're sort of busybody, Rotarian taxi driver kind of people, 19th hole bores who want to rock up to any old meeting and give someone direct their peace of mind. So I think, it's a skewed self-selecting, as Sam says, group. And they do tend to kind of want their say from whomever they can get.
Artificial intelligence. Is it a bit of a slippery slope to be on when it comes to election campaigning? Sam, I'm going to throw to you here. Talk us through why on earth we're talking about AI.
Yeah, so this all kicked off earlier in the week when the National Party shared one of their deliberately low-quality memes, I think, saying that New Zealanders were sick of two things, the Fast and the Furious movies and Chris Hipkins and Grant Robertson's reckless spending. Now, there were two issues with it. The first, which everyone has overlooked, is that nobody should be sick of the Fast and Furious movies. They are about family, they are about unity, they are about a multicultural group working together. And I think, the National Party and New Zealand as a whole should be getting behind that. So I'm just going to defend Fast and Furious first of all. I haven't seen the latest movie, so I could yet change my mind, but I'm going to stand behind them for the time being. But the main issue that people noticed was that the photo of the Fast and Furious cast was in fact not a photo, and it was not the Fast and the Furious cast. It was some very strange looking lookalikes. And then that people raised the question, is this actually a photo or is this an AI generated image? And there was a bit of humming and hawing. Christopher Luxon didn't seem to actually know when he was asked about it the next day, but it transpired that yes, it was. And actually the National Party has been using AI to generate a lot of its imagery for recent ads that have gone up online on Facebook and social media. So this is not shocking. We're seeing it happen a lot more overseas, and it kind of makes sense. Why would you pay for a stock photo or run the risk of having someone in a stock photo that is not a fan of you, as this government had back in, what was it, the 2018 budget, I think, where the model on the front cover of the budget had left for Australia because they could no longer afford to live in New Zealand. So if you make it someone digital, then that fixes a lot of issues. But there are a lot of ethical questions that come up around this. I think in the United States, we saw a Republican ad that was that created a dystopian video based on a future where, the US had reinstated the draft. I think it had gone to war with Taiwan, and it showed the sort of country in ruins and Joe Biden sitting at his desk sort of grimacing, but none of it was real. So you kind of say, do we need to have some sort of restrictions or rules in place around this? And, to be clear, what we've seen from the Nat so far has not been at that level, but clearly there is the potential for things to be misused if there isn't sufficient regulation. And another example that springs to mind was Amnesty International used some imagery, AI-generated imagery of protests in Colombia, and shared it with a report. And now that they had disclosed in the report, I think, that it was AI photos, but once you strip that from its context and it gets shared around the world and people think it's real, then that's really problematic, right? If you can't distinguish between what is real and what is not real, that brings a number of problems. So I think it's something that I'm sure is on the minds of officials here, AI more generally in regulation, but we probably need to think about it in the context of political campaigning. What are your views, Tim? Do you think it's something we need to sort of have some form of regulation around, or is it a bit too much ado about nothing?
Oh no, it's very, very risky, and there's dangers in this. Just on that video from the States that you mentioned, Sam, of the dystopian future and Biden and the draft and so on. Interestingly, even the Republican National Committee put a tag on that which said an AI-generated look into the country's possible future if Joe Biden is re-elected. So even the RNC was willing to sort of acknowledge, and that's where I think we could get some kind of clarity and agreement if parties are willing to front up, even in the asterisks, attached to their material, what they're using and how. The actual overview of algorithms being used in political campaigns is old. They've been targeting, they've been using, information about voter types and voter preferences and so on through algorithms and powerful computers. This is now, though, generative AI allows you to do things like the founder of fake news, Donald Trump, just last month after his CNN town hall meeting, issued an ad on his social media, Truth Social, in which he told people in the voice of Anderson Cooper, the CNN host, expressing views on that town hall that weren't Anderson's views. But then Mr. Fake News was not one to let his viewers and listeners know that that was fake news.
Our newsroom audience question today is it possible National will do a cup of tea deal with New Zealand First and Northland? Now, just to explain a cup of tea, basically all we're talking about here is, are they going to have a little bit of a wink, wink, nod, nod? We'll let you have that seat, and that way you can partner with us and make everyone's life easier. Short answer from me, no, I don't think it's going to happen. But actually, Sam, I feel like maybe you might have a slightly different view just because you normally do when it comes to me. Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it would be foolish in the extreme for National to look at doing a deal. Now, it could be quite tempting. You say Winston Peters has spoken very disparagingly about Labor, seems disinclined to work with them. Can we get 4% extra from having New Zealand First join in? Maybe that's appealing, but I think it's a matter of trust. Could you trust New Zealand First enough to make any sort of deal? And would New Zealand First be willing to do a deal? I'm not necessarily sure that they would. So I think there's a lot of risk there for National, and the upside is probably not worth it.
Well, you've also got a situation where you've got Shane Jones in Northland, who I think this is his 5th seat campaign, and he hasn't won one yet. So why would we be thinking that it might be different this time?
Does Shane have the energy to win a seat, or the inclination, as you say? And just on the record up there, what would National be thinking? They ought not to do it, and they won't do it, in my view.
Yeah, it's just a totally different kettle of fish to Epsom and ACT. And I mean, to give David Seymour a little bit of credit here, I think we're at the point now with that Epsom seat too, where David Seymour is very much doing the work. And I mean, would it be fair to say he wins that seat kind of on his own now?
I would think so.
Yeah. So I don't know. What is this? Is there a need for cup of teas?
Well, there always have been, and for both major parties looking to secure that extra leg. With ACT now, I think you'd find if you went out there into that electorate and did a really good poll, a proper poll, that there'd be a lot of support for Seymour and ACT, which would be a clear win for them. It's become that way, it's embedded. But, so you don't need it for ACT, maybe you'd think of something else, but I don't think Northland for New Zealand First is the one you go for.
I actually this is a massive diversion here, but if you look at Auckland Central, I think you could almost say that Labor has had a cup of tea with the Greens without actually having the cup of tea, and that they have not bothered at all to even try in that seat up against Chloe Swarbrick.
Yeah, and no disrespect to the two candidates for Labor or National, but it does look like the major parties have walked away from that one pretty much.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you think others might enjoy. Dim.
Well, I've got something for people to watch. It's a short, spookily accurate video by UK comedian Matt Green on how every political scandal develops and how politicians shift their positions. Well worth a laugh. Go have a look.
And what about you, Sam?
Yeah, my recommendation for this week is actually a lovely piece by our gallery colleague, Emma Hatton, about the work that police did after Cyclone Gabrielle to track down all the people in Hawke's Bay and further afield who were uncontactable. Not super political, but actually got some great insights into the great work that is done by our police and what was a very trying time and some of their concerns around the misinformation that was spreading about what was going on. So it's well worth a read.
And my recommendation this week is a piece that was on Stuff by political commentator Ben Thomas. It's titled "Overseas Image of Our Prime Minister Has Gone From Sought After to Sausage Rolls." It's just a fun piece looking at the differences on the international stage between Chris Hipkins and Jacinda Ardern, and just gets into the fact that actually the international stuff doesn't matter so much given it's election year and there's actually a lot happening at home, but it's got some pretty funny one-liners in it, so I definitely recommend that one. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producers, Hugo Stewart and Mark Jennings, our readers, listeners, and watchers. Please send me any burning questions that you have. You can email me on jo.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. Thank you to Sam and Tim for your contributions as always. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.